Welcome to a study of Paul's letter to the Romans, lesson number 8. It will cover sections entitled Life Through the Spirit, Future Glory, and More Than Conquerors. And I hate to tell you, I'm going to not translate that more than conquerors because that's not really what it means, but I hate to disturb that King James felicitation. It's a really great way to put it, but in the interest of truth, we'll choose truth over poetry. Maybe you've had time now to open your NIV New Testament to Romans 8, and this is a chapter on a comparison between the present suffering that believers undergo and the blessings of the new age, and which Paul basically says the blessings of the age to come are so great by living in the presence of God and Christ that any amount of suffering in this life fades into insignificance. First of all, he talks about life through the Spirit. I came from a tradition that downplayed the Spirit. One of their formative experiences as a group of believers was the Great Cane Ridge meeting that went for months in the summer of 1803 in central Tennessee. And it was full of excesses, barking like dogs, and rolling in the floor, and all kinds of things. And it left a mark where we just were a little afraid of the Spirit. And so it wasn't until I was a mature preacher that I really learned to depend on the Spirit. So this is what this is about right now. Life through the Spirit. Romans 8 to 17 verses. Paul uses the retrospective conjunction. I'm not an English teacher, but by that I mean a conjunction, therefore. Now, therefore can point either backward to what you have just said, and then therefore something is a conclusion, or it can point to something you're about to say. And here it's retrospective. By that he means what he has just said applies in this way, which makes the text a consequence of what he's just said. This confirms the struggle, and it is one that all believers will have as long as they are not in their redeemed bodies. In spite of this struggle that he's having, staying right with God, there is no condemnation, because the relationship between sin and death has been nullified by the relationship between the Spirit and life. Where the Spirit of God is, there is life. God breathed into Adam's nostrils, and he became a living being. It is the Spirit of God in us that gives us both physical life and then the gift of the Spirit when we're baptized into Christ and into his death, that gives us life. Life in the body, physical body, life in the spiritual body. In spite of this struggle, I need to emphasize that. I find that there's two kinds of people in the believers. One that is super sensitive, and every little thing they do, they question, and they never can get comfortable in their newfound life. And then there are believers that just do whatever they want to and don't pay any attention. The truth is, we have to pay attention, we have to be careful, we have to make right choices, but that's not what's going to give us life in the age to come. It is the Spirit of God dwelling in us. As he always does, Paul insists that this nullification does not make the law of Moses evil, since it is the believer's sinful self that brings it about. The law condemns us not because the law is bad, but because we are bad, and we need to constantly be aware of that. However, the believer must make a constant effort to overcome the influence of their unredeemed self, because to surrender to one's sinful self always leads to death. Years ago, there was a song called Doing What Comes Naturally, and always used it as long as it was a popular song to illustrate what is not true for the believer. If you do what comes naturally, we're children of wrath, Paul says. And if you just go lickety-split through life and do what you want to do, you're going to die eternally. The believer is not alone in this struggle, though. I dare not say, well, don't blame me, it's just my sinful self. Because once I was baptized into the death of Christ, it is no longer I that live. It is the I of me that is assisted by the Spirit of God. I am an inspirited sinner, and therefore I have resources that I did not have before I surrendered to Christ. This means that our choices will lead to the redemption of our bodies, which are now subject to death and decay. My body is naturally a mortal body that's subject to death and decay. But with the Spirit in this mortal body, I am made immortal when my time comes to die. And he will, even as he would not allow his Holy One, the Christ, to suffer death and decay, he will not allow me, whose life has been entwined with Christ, to suffer permanent death and decay. My body will be made immortal, not because it is by nature, but because it has the Spirit of Christ dwelling in it. This means that we're morally obligated to make the choices that please God. Notice I use the term morally obligated. It's difficult to find a term because it is not that I have to do it. Christ doesn't stand over me with a bullwhip like a slave driver, but he is always over there entreating me through love to make the right choices. That is an entirely different thing. And I need to concentrate on making correct choices. I knew some people that laughed at when we studied George Washington and the way he improved himself to become a Virginia Tidewater gentleman. He made a list of all the virtues he wanted to practice. And at the end of each week, he totaled it up to see whether he had made choices that led that direction. That's not a bad idea, so long as you don't get the idea that you're buying your salvation by good works, but that you are choosing Christ freely each day. Those who are led by the Spirit are the true children of God, because the Spirit enables us to have an intimate relationship with God, a relationship with God that is equal to that of Christ, thus to share in the rewards he has received for his faithfulness to the Father. However, that does not mean that I will escape the sufferings inherent in living in this present age. Remember, crucifixion always precedes resurrection. Now the future glory, Romans 8:18 through 27. However, Paul considers any sufferings that a believer may suffer in this present age are insignificant when compared to the reward of living in the new age. The suffering which all believers will endure in this present age, whether these sufferings are caused by living, are caused by poor choices, will hinder us unless we realize that we have brought these sufferings on ourselves and turn to God for forgiveness and for strength. In the last few days, I have been really upset and depressed by some aspects in my life, and just to be honest with you, caused by my computer. And I have been times when I wanted to take a crowbar to it and dismember it and just leave it in little pieces. But that would not be very Christian either. But that's suffering. I find some believers, since they don't suffer persecution, they think something's wrong with it. No, what Paul's talking about here is, if you live this life, you will suffer. There's disease, there's bad people, there's bad choices. You will suffer. And the question is, will you suffer with Christ or will you suffer without Christ? And the two are vastly different. The life of the believer is a win-win situation. The suffering you're going to endure, but if you do it as a believer in Christ, you know that you're dwelling with him in the new age eternally is assured. And you can always compare and say, look, I'm suffering. I've got a toothache, I've got a bellyache, I've got all kinds of things that make the life miserable. But you can always look and say, but I have Christ as my goal, and I'm going to live with him forever. And then the passage is usually talked about more than conquerors. Romans 8:28 through 39. This is true, what I've just said about the win-win situation, because the God who created the universe uses all the elements of that creation for the benefit of those who love him. Just think about that. The same power that put the Andromeda galaxy in place is working in your behalf. I have a book given to me by the director of the Hubble Telescope project. He was a member of the congregation where I preached in Northern Virginia. And when I really want to immerse myself in the glory of God, I just take that multicolored volume. It's 1 yard square, and I look at it and I say, the power that did this is on my side. Come on, you bullies, you bad people, you poor choices, come on. I've got a God who loves me, and He will not allow me to be separated from that love. Since this is a survey, I will not deal with God's foreknowledge and predestination. That's too complicated a subject. What Paul is assuring us is that God has chosen us. It is not we who have chosen Him. And He is a totally moral and holy individual. And when He selects somebody, He is on their side. If God is for us, who then can be against us? And then that's when the King James translators had a really inspiration. We're more than conquerors. And this alludes to the idea of the Roman general who conquered a province and added a new province to the Roman Empire. And he was allowed to bring his soldiers inside the walls of Rome and march in triumph with them. And what Paul wanted us to get is that we are better and more blessed than any Roman general, because it is not the people and Senate of Rome that stands behind us. It is our God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ. If He is for us, who then can be against us? He has chosen you. And as I said, I don't have any intention of going into that difficult subject in this survey course, but He has chosen you, and having chosen you, He will not let go. You know, we have a lot of adventure things on television. And not too long ago I heard there was somebody slipped over the railing of a bridge, and it was about 60 feet down to solid rock. And the only thing that saved him was his buddy grabbed him by the wrist and just held on until somebody could come help him. Well, that's God. He is always there, and hand in hand. And friends, there is no power in the universe that can overcome that. And that's what it means. We're more than conquerors through Him who loved us. We should consider it no coincidence that a strong east wind parted the Red Sea at the exact moment the children of Israel arrived at its shores. These so-called coincidences happen again and again. In my life, I've had equally fortuitous circumstances. And I don't claim to be as holy as Moses, although that might not be too hard to be. But I do claim that God loves me, and that I want to share that love with everyone. My friends, God has selected you, and He will not let you go. Thank you. Have a good day.